This is a new read aloud by author Cousin Kate, Catherine Douglas Bell. She lived from 1818 to 1861. I have a couple of other of her books, about 3 of them, on Facebook and on YouTube, where I have read them out loud. This one is called The Amulet, or Love Thy Neighbor as Thyself. This book doesn't have as much scripture in it, but it does have a great Christian message in it. Minnie Gray and her mother had been sitting together for some time at work without speaking, when Minnie suddenly broke the silence by saying, with great earnestness, "Mama, I do wish there were fairies now." Mrs. Gray looked up with a smile, and Minnie added quickly, "Oh, of course, Mama, I know quite well that there never were fairies. I am not so silly," with an air of great good sense, "as to believe in fairy tales, only I do wish that fairy tales were true, and that fairies now lived on the earth, and that I could get at them." "Indeed, Minnie, and may I ask what wondrous fairy gift is now specially in your mind?" "Oh, no gift for myself," in a self-satisfied tone, "or at least no gift to give pleasure to myself alone. Mine is not a selfish wish, Mama. If I could see a fairy this moment, I should only ask from her the power to make all around me happy." "A modest request, dear Minnie, certainly. At least, Mama, it is not a selfish one. I have been thinking about it all day. In the morning when George looked so dull because you and Papa were displeased with him for being too late for prayers, and Harry was so much vexed at losing his nicely written theme, it came into my head how pleasant it would be if I could, in one moment, with one word or motion of my hand, make them quite happy again. Then after breakfast, I thought of it again when I saw little Susan and Ella fretting because the snow shower had prevented them from getting out, and little Hugh crying over his broken cart, and poor Betsy in the nursery in such deep grief because she had heard that her father was very ill, and my own good Miss Harvey came in looking so grave and sad because her brother had not got the situation he wished for." "Take breath, my dear," said Mrs. Gray, smiling. "So long a list of calamities has quite overwhelmed you." "Well, but Mama, don't you agree with me that it would be delightful to possess some talisman or amulet by which one could remove all these sorrows in a moment, by which one could make everyone happy?" "And can you not do a little towards such a happy result even without a fairy amulet, Minnie?" Mrs. Gray asked gravely. "Oh, but a little would not content me," Minnie answered with some impatience. "And it would be at best so very little that I can do. Now, you know, with a fairy gift such as I think of, I could do so much, so very much. But in the meantime, Minnie, might it not be as well to do at least the little that is in your power?" "Oh, of course, Minnie said with increased impatience. "There, that tiresome thread has got into a knot again. I really must put away my work now. My hands are so hot, and the thread is so tiresome, getting into knots incessantly. But will Susan not be disappointed if her doll's petticoat is not ready for her tomorrow? There is so little to do, it seems a pity not to finish it when she expects you will," Mrs. Gray said persuasively. "Oh, I never promised to finish it tonight. I only said I should finish it as soon as I could." Yes, as soon as you could," her mama said with grave emphasis. "But I cannot finish it tonight. No one could work on it with hands so hot as mine are," Minnie answered fretfully. The conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Minnie's eldest brother, George. He looked harassed, and began to turn over the books on the table as if in search of something he could not find. "Have you lost anything, George?" his mama asked kindly. "It is the little book about ferns which Uncle Maurice lent me last summer. He is with Papa just now and wishes to have it to take home with him, and I cannot find it. I have not got through half my lessons and," with a disturbed glance at the little timepiece, "it is almost 8 o'clock." Mrs. Gray looked significantly at Minnie, but Minnie was busy putting her workbox in order and took no further notice of George's troubles than to remark complacently that it was very foolish of him not to keep his books and things in better order. She always knew where to find everything she wanted. George's vexation was not diminished by a remark provokingly unseasonable when he was in distress and provokingly unsuitable from a younger sister. He might have made an angry retort had not Mrs. Gray interfered by rising and going to help her boy in his search. With her aid, the book was found, and George went away quite happy. There was still time, he said, to learn all his lessons, and he was very much obliged to his mamma. Mrs. Gray sat down again to her work. Minnie had arranged her workbox to her liking and was luxuriating in perfect idleness, sitting before the fire, dreaming pleasantly of all the happiness she could confer on everyone if she had only the wished-for fairy gift. She was awakened from her reverie by her mother's voice. "Minnie," she said, "I think I have seen in an old book I have upstairs directions relative to such an amulet as you desire. Suppose I were to try to make you one." "Oh, Mamma!" Minnie cried, springing up from her seat. "How delightful! But," in a disappointed tone, "of course you are not in earnest. You are laughing at me. There are no such things as amulets. At least they are of no use." "Well," said Mrs. Gray, smiling, "I cannot promise that my amulet shall equal our old fairy friends in efficacy. But, at any rate, if you like, I shall make you one according to these directions I speak of, and we shall see whether it will be of use or not." "Like, oh, of course I should like it," Minnie cried eagerly. "But, Mamma, what is it? How do you make it? Is it worn around the neck? Does it—" Stop, my dear. I shall not answer any questions about it. You shall see when it is made." "And when shall I see it, Mamma? When will you make it?" "Tomorrow. If nothing unforeseen occurs, I shall have it ready by tomorrow night. I shall bring it to you when I come to see you after you have gone to bed. But remember, I shall expect you not to torment me with questions. If you occupy my time and thoughts unnecessarily, I shall not be able to keep my promise." "Oh, but I shall not tease or occupy you in any way. I shall take care to keep the little ones from teasing you," was Minnie's eager promise. And she kept it. Prompted by the strong desire to see and possess her amulet, she was particularly well behaved all the next day, and took a great deal of pains to amuse the younger children and to keep them from annoying her mamma or interrupting her in her occupations. When Minnie could do this when she chose, it was a pity that she did not more frequently consider her mother's comfort and give her more help in taking care of the little ones. The day seemed a very long one to Minnie. At no time particularly fond of playing with her younger brother and sisters, she felt it very irksome to conform herself to their tastes and fancies so entirely as was necessary to keep them good-humored and happy, and with her mind full of thoughts about the amulet, the constant claims upon her attention became very trying. The longest day must, however, come to a close. The last hour had passed rapidly and pleasantly in play with her elder brothers, and now bedtime had come. The long wished-for hour. Prayers were over. Minnie had wished her papa and mamma good night and gone to her room. She had gone through the usual form of reading a chapter of the Bible and of kneeling to pray, but I fear she thought more of her amulet more than anything else. She jumped into bed and lay waiting and listening to every sound. The parlor door opened. Minnie heard her mother's step on the stair. Mrs. Gray went to her own room. She has gone for the amulet, Minnie thought, and although she repeated for the 20th time that day, "Of course, I know Mamma is only jesting. Of course, I know she cannot really make an amulet," yet her heart beat quick with expectation, and she watched the door with eager, straining eyes. "Oh, Mamma, have you got it?" she cried, breathing breathlessly, springing up in bed when her mother came in. With a good-humored smile at the child's eagerness, Mrs. Gray went up to the bedside and placed in her hands the wished-for treasure. Very pretty it was, a small round bag of crimson velvet, about the size of a crown, fringed all around with twisted loops of little gold beads, the strings of fine gold cord, with beautiful tiny fairy-looking tassels. Minnie was delighted. Now she looked at it closely to admire the delicate workmanship of fringe and tassels, and now held it up at a little distance that the light of the lamp might sparkle on the beads while she poured forth an overwhelmingly torrent of exclamations, praises, and questions. "How did you ever think of making it, Mama? How beautiful it is, so exactly like a real fairy amulet. How much trouble you have taken with it." "I shall not grudge the trouble if the amulet answers its purpose," Mrs. Gray said, a little seriously. "Ah, Mama, you are laughing at me," Minnie said, laughing herself. "Of course, I know there is no fairy gift connected with it, pretty though it be." "You have not read the words of magic," Mrs. Gray answered, pointing to some words embroidered in the gold thread on the side of the bag. Minnie had seen the embroidery, but in her first excitement of surprise and pleasure, she had not thought of reading the words. She now looked at them with eager curiosity. The letters, though small, were very distinct, and she easily read aloud the words, "As ye would that men should do to you, do ye also to them likewise." There was a long pause. Minnie looked grave and a little disappointed. Mrs. Gray watched her face for a few minutes in silence, and then said gently, "Why that look of disappointment, my Minnie? You did not seriously expect that my amulet was to confer on you a fairy gift?" "No, oh no, Mama, but..." "But what, my child?" Minnie did not answer, and Mrs. Gray continued still more gently and kindly. "Are you vexed to think how much the wished-for fairy power depends upon yourself? Are you unwilling to test the efficacy of my amulet?" "Why, no, Mama, it is not that," speaking slowly and with hesitation. "But you see, Mama, this is nothing new. No, Minnie, I told you that I should find the directions for my amulet in an old book. But does that make them less valuable?" was Mrs. Gray's serious answer. "Oh, Mama, of course not. But then, you see, I have known these words for a long, long time, and yet I have not been able to make people happy." "Knowing God's commandments and keeping them are two different things, my child," Mrs. Gray answered. "Have you tried how far the keeping of this one might help to make others happy?" Minnie did not answer. She was always very unwilling to confess at fault. But she was truthful and could not say that she had tried much to keep this commandment. Mrs. Gray stooped down and kissed her affectionately. "Good night, my love," she said. "I do not wish you to answer my questions now. Nay, I do not wish to answer it to me at all, unless you please. Think over it and answer it to yourself at your leisure. You wish to wear your amulet round your neck, so I have made for it this outer covering. Those pretty gilt tassels might not be very pleasant on your neck if they were not covered." And she put into Minnie's hands a neat black silk bag just large enough to hold the gyre, one, tassels and all. A narrow piece of black velvet with a pretty clasp was fastened to this outer bag, so that it was probably to the gayer one, tassels and all. A narrow piece of black velvet with a pretty clasp was fastened to this outer bag, so that Minnie could easily wear the amulet concealed under her dress in the approved style of fairy tales. Minnie thanked her mamma warmly for this fresh instance of consideration, and Mrs. Gray, again kissing her, put out the light and left her. Minnie sat up in bed and, by the light of a bright moon, carefully packed her pretty amulet into its case, musing gratefully as she did so upon her mamma's kindness, upon the care she had taken to meet her wishes in every particular, and how little she had grudged either time or trouble to give her pleasure. It should not be in vain, Minnie thought, as she lay down after carefully depositing her treasure under her pillow. I ought to let Mamma see that her pretty amulet has done me good, and perhaps after all she may be right. Perhaps I do not try enough to do to others as I would they should do to me. At least, not always. Having once admitted the possibility of error, although only in the form of a feint, perhaps Minnie was able to judge herself more fairly. She began to think over the various unhappiness which at first aroused her wish for a fair gift, and to inquire about how far she might have remedied them by the due observance of the rule on her amulet. Her brother George's had been the first gloomy face of the day. He had displeased his parents by being too late for prayers, hence his unhappiness. That George was too fond of his bed and very apt to sleep too long were facts well known to every member of the family. Harry, who shared his room generally, took upon himself the task of getting him out of bed in good time. But on Wednesday morning, Harry had begun to give reading lessons to a poor orphan boy in whom they were all interested and who was so much occupied through the day that an early morning hour was the only one he could give to his education. Many had known of Harry's engagement, had heard him go downstairs, and the room the boys occupied had being directly above her own, had listened and ascertained that George was not beginning to move about. Nay, further, it had even occurred to her that it would only be kind and sisterly to go upstairs and awake him. But when the story which she had left half finished, the night before was so interesting, she did so long to know the end, and the charms of the storybook, and the bright fire she knew she should find in the breakfast room, had overcome the wish to serve her brother. She had gone straight downstairs and left George to take care of himself. And Harry's lost version. Minnie blushed as she remembered that, while undressing on Tuesday night, she had recollected to have seen this same version lying in a perilous position on the corner of the mantel shelf, where it was liable to be thrown down inside the fender and carried off by the housemaid in the morning. She had thought of going up to warn Harry about it. But the passage upstairs was dark, and it was so disagreeable to go groping along a dark passage, knocking oneself against doors and walls, and besides, Minnie had taken off her frock. It would be so much trouble to put it on again. In this case, as in the former, Minnie hardly required to ask herself the question, should I have liked him to do so to me? As respected the misfortune of the little girls and Hugh, Minnie's conscience was more clear in the first consideration of the case. Of course, she could not have prevented the snow shower, nor could she have mended Hugh's broken cart. But she had scarcely satisfied herself with such assertion before the question arose to her mind. Could she not have made some amends to the little ones for disasters she could not altogether prevent? Could she not have amused the little girls with a story? And might not the judicious loan of one of her own playthings have made Hugh forget his cart? And Minnie recalled days gone by, when she too was little and had cried over a broken doll or a rainy day, and when her mamma had laid aside her book or work to devise amusement for her disappointed or fretful child. Minnie had liked her mother to do so to her. In similar circumstances, she should like her mother to do so now. But she had not done so to her brother and sisters. The disappointment to Miss Harvey's brother, the accident to Betty's father, were certainly matters above and beyond her power, but Minnie's conscience was more keen-sighted now, and it soon occurred to her that she had been Miss Harvey, that had she been Miss Harvey, she should have liked a more docile and attentive pupil than Minnie Gray had been on that same Wednesday, and she felt that it might have been some comfort to poor Betsy in her sore grief to have been relieved of the charge of the little girls and Hugh, while nurse was occupied with the baby, who was ill, and Mrs. Gray was engaged with visitors. Again Minnie blushed as she remembered that her mamma's first thought on being at liberty had been to send for the children, and as she thought how easily she could have taken charge of them, and so have relieved the young nursery maid an hour sooner from the irksome task of amusing them, while her heart was heavy with grief and anxiety. These thoughts and recollections were mortifying to Minnie's self-love, but yet there was something cheering in them too. It was pleasant to see how many ways of being useful were open to her, how much she had it in her power to do for the happiness of others. "Yes, my pretty amulet," she said, as she once more took it into her hand. "I shall wear you every day, and you shall remind me always to do to others as I should like others to do to me." And well pleased with herself for her good resolution and anticipated good behavior, Minnie fell asleep. On awakening the next morning, Minnie's first thought was about her pretty amulet. Her second was given to her good resolution, and she sprang out of bed with the pleasure feeling of one who had a great deal to do, who was going to be very useful, to be like a sunbeam in the house, bringing pleasure to everyone. To get her brother, George, up in proper time was naturally the first good office which presented itself to her mind. This was again one of the mornings devoted to poor Ned. Harry was busy with him, and George was left to sleep on it in peace. But Minnie resolved that it should not be her fault if he were too late for prayers this morning. She knew well that it was useless to wake him too soon. He would certainly fall asleep again. If he did not rise immediately, he would certainly not rise until he could not help it. So, as Minnie was particularly early this morning, she did not go up to him until she was herself ready to go to the dining room. As she reached the foot of the stairs, she heard his room door open and a light step on the passage, and looking up, she saw her mamma coming down. "Oh, Mamma," she cried, "you have been before me. You have roused George." "Yes, I have got the lazy boy fairly out of bed," Mrs. Gray said, smiling, "so you are spared that trouble. But I am very glad, dear, that you thought of it." And she looked so glad, so approving, that Minnie was quite elated. "Oh, Mamma, it was the amulet, you see," she answered with a happy little blush, and kissing her mother, she ran gaily downstairs, well pleased with herself, and well pleased to have a good deal of time at her disposal before prayers. She wished to crochet a purse for her papa's Christmas present. Her daily governess, Miss Harvey, had promised to teach her how to make a new kind with steel beads, and Minnie was glad to have time to wind the silk and thread some of the beads before Miss Harvey came. The skeins of silk were entangled and took longer to wind than Minnie had expected, and she had only finished doing it when the family began to assemble for prayers. George was in time and no more. He came in last and came in looking very cold and miserable. It was a cold morning with a keen north wind. The boys' bedroom was a very cold one, at the top of the house and facing the north. Harry had opened the window to feed his pigeons, and shutting it carelessly had left a little chink open. Poor sleepy George had been so hurried that he had no time to think of anything except getting ready in time. He had not observed the open window and the keen, biting blast that had been blowing in upon him all the time he was dressing and reading his Bible, so that by the time he got downstairs he was thoroughly chilled and very miserable. He hastened to the fire, but before he had time even to stretch out his cold blue hands over it, the gong sounded for prayers, and Mr. Gray, looking around, said, "Take your seat, my boy. The servants are coming in." George looked ruefully at his accustomed seat, which happened to be near one of the windows and far from the fire. Minnie's, on the contrary, was, by right of the eldest daughter, next to her father, and in most comfortable proximity to the bright hearth. "Minnie," George whispered entreatingly, "should you mind much changing places for just this once? I am so cold." "Mind? Of course I should. I don't see why I should give up my own seat," Minnie said crossly, but she caught her mother's eye. At the same moment, a sudden turn of her head caused her to feel the clasp of the amulet on her neck. She rose, saying, "You may take it if you like," but she said it so ungraciously and moved away so reluctantly that she attracted Mr. Gray's notice to what was going on. "George," he said a little sharply, "I'm ashamed of you. How can you think of taking your sister's seat?" "Oh, never mind, Papa," Minnie said with the air of a martyr. "He may keep it if he likes." The servants coming in, there was no time for more. George kept the seat, but he felt very uncomfortable. Naturally of a kind and obliging disposition, it was real pain to him to read in Minnie's discontented face how great she felt the sacrifice she had made for him, and he had been so carefully trained to consider it a brother's duty to protect his sister, to care for her comfort, and to give her the preference in all things, that he was haunted with a disagreeable sense of shame at having allowed her to give way to him. During both prayers and breakfast, their self-reproachful feelings were constantly recurring, not perhaps deep enough to make him positively unhappy, but yet sufficiently distinct. If I can find my place again. To make him feel uncomfortable and out of spirits, and to make him wish very heartily that he had never asked Minnie to change her seat. Minnie observed his dejection and with a feeling half disappointed, half triumphant. It does not seem as if I could do so much good. After all, perhaps it has been less my fault than Mama thinks, that I have not made people happier all this time. Breakfast was very early at the Grays, as the boys had to be at school by 9 o'clock, and their school was at a considerable distance. Miss Harvey did not come to the little girls till 10, so that Minnie had more than an hour for her own occupations. Of this she now eagerly availed herself to get on with stringing the steel beads so as to be quite ready for Miss Harvey's instructions. She was so busy and so much interested in her occupations that she took no note of what was passing and did not know that anyone was in the room until a deep sigh from one corner caught her ear. She looked up and saw Ella sitting on the floor before a large box of bricks. About half a dozen were in her lap, and she was looking despairingly from them to the box, already as it seemed too full, but which ought to have held these in addition. "What is the matter, Ella?" Minnie asked. The little face brightened directly. She hoped to get help in her trouble. "Oh, Minnie," she cried, "it is those tiresome bricks. Mama says I must put them all right before I leave them, and Nurse is waiting to show me how to make Dolly's petticoat, and she says she shall not be able to do anything for me after Baby awakes, and Miss Harvey will be here very soon, and by the time I have said my lesson, Baby will be sure to be awake. You stupid little thing. You should not have taken out the bricks when you knew how little time you should have to play with them," Minnie answered carelessly, and bending again over her beads. "I only forgot," Ella sighed in a low, disappointed tone, the hopes of assistance fading away before Minnie's determined air of preoccupation. A minute or two passed in silence. Then came another very deep sigh from Ella. Minnie took no notice, but she heard it, and it fretted her to hear it. It fretted her still more to feel the amulet lying on her neck, and to see with her mind's eye its pretty little golden words. Ella made another vain effort to thrust in one of her bricks, and then, with tearful eyes and in a timid voice, entreated Minnie to help her. Very cross was Minnie's face, still crosser her voice, saying, "Tiresome little monkey!" As she threw down her needle and went to her little sister, she pulled impatiently at the clasp, fastening the velvet ribbon as if it were choking her. Crosser and crosser grew both looks and tone when she reached the spot and saw the state of the unfortunate bricks. "Oh, you are very idle and careless, Ella. I am sure you know quite well that it is not the way to put them in. Each one has its proper place. How could you ever expect to get them all into the box that confused, tumbling about way?" Ella looked very sorry, very penitent. She did not know how to put them properly away, but she had been in too great haste. Her little head had been too full of thoughts about her doll's petticoat to be able to attend properly to the packing of the bricks. "I am very sorry, Minnie, but it was these difficult sloping pieces. They would not lie smooth." "Difficult sloping pieces? Nonsense! They are as easily put away as any others. It was only that you did not choose to take pains. You're the most careless, stupid child I ever saw." And Minnie began to throw out the bricks with heedless, impatient violence. Little Ella drew her feet out of the way of the fast-flying pieces and sat with melancholy countenance, watching Minnie's angry looks and gestures, and wishing she were not so stupid and careless. And now Minnie had reached the beginning of the difficulties. The first 2 or 3 rows had been laid in neatly and well, but 4 wedge-shaped bricks had puzzled poor Ella's preoccupied mind. She had forgotten that the thick part of the one should be laid on the thin part of the other one below, and after trying many wrong ways, had at last in despair placed them across each other, and tried to cover them as quickly as possible with straight pieces. "Now look, you stupid monkey, how they ought to lie, and don't be so careless again. And don't sit gaping there, but give me up the bricks. You might at any rate do so much to help me when you have given me so much trouble. Give me that long brick." "Not that one, stupid," as the frightened child hastily presented the one she could most quickly get. "There, Get out of the way. You are doing wrong on purpose, I do believe," and pushing her violently from her, Minnie finished her packing in silent displeasure. Ella watched her with tearful eyes, and when at last she dismissed with an ungracious, "You can go now, child. Don't stand staring there. Don't you see I have put away the box?" She went slowly and sadly up to the nursery, oppressed with a sense of her own great stupidity and thoughtlessness. Minnie resumed her seat and her stringing of beads, but with no very pleasant feeling. She felt for her amulet as she sat down and tried to congratulate herself on having observed its commandment. But in spite of herself, Ella's downcast, melancholy little face would present itself before her mind, and she could not feel so satisfied with herself as she wished. Poor Minnie! She certainly had bungled in her first attempts to observe her new rule, and so it was through the day. In the desire to show her unselfishness, her readiness to do others as she wished others to do to her, she made her friends uncomfortable instead of serving them. Now, with ostentation, giving up her own way when no one required it of her, and now with ill-timed officiousness, pressing her services with which could have been well dispensed with. Her governess, Miss Harvey, was on her this day suffering from intense headache. From the moment Minnie discovered the fact, she tormented the poor sufferer with unceasing questions about how she felt, with uncalled-for expressions of sympathy, and useless proposals of a remedy. Now she insisted upon Miss Harvey's trying a different seat for the one she usually occupied until the other yielded the point, and chose a less convenient position in preference to the annoyance of further argument. Now she interrupted a difficult explanation to Susan by an eager request to be allowed to fetch her a footstool or a pillow, when her poor Miss Harvey was only anxious to get through her duties as quickly and peaceably as possible. Minnie impeded her in every way, distracting Ella and Susan's attention by exhortations to them to be quiet and attentive, and saying her own lessons particularly ill, while her eyes were wandering around the room in search of some supposed crevice through which the air might come upon Miss Harvey, or her thoughts were busy in her mother's medicine chest, seeking a specific for headache. Even gentle Miss Harvey's patience gave way, and worn out with a long argument upon the propriety of Minnie's omitting her usual music lesson, she exclaimed, "Oh, Minnie, you are a very tiresome child." Greatly offended, Minnie became instantly silent, but as it was silence of sullenness, it did not greatly relieve poor Miss Harvey's harassment and discomfort, and as her thoughts were now as much occupied with her own wrongs as they had been before with the proofs of her own goodness. I am not sure that the silent, dignified Minnie was much more attentive than the talkative, officious Minnie had been. Certainly Minnie had singularly failed in making her kind governess happy. In the afternoon, Minnie had a visit from her cousin Sophia. The two girls had arranged to take a long walk on the morrow to see an old woman who had been nursed in their grandfather's family, but Sophia had this forenoon received an invitation to spend the following day with a young friend and to go with her to see a private collection of pictures which she had so greatly desired to see. And she had come to ask Minnie if she should dislike putting off their walk to another day. Now, Minnie did not really care about this delay. On the contrary, she did not think the walk would be pleasant so long as the cold north wind lasted, but she did not say so pleasantly and cheerfully as she might have done. Determined to show herself unselfish, she gave the required consent with a lofty air of generosity and an ostentatious appearance of self-sacrifice which made poor Sophia fear that she had done wrong to ask it, and that she had really deprived Minnie of a great pleasure. Sophia went home at liberty to accept the pleasant invitation, but not much, if at all, happier than she might have been had her request been refused. When the boys returned from school, Harry ran hastily into the drawing-room, asking for a book. Minnie was reading it at the time. Harry did not see this, and, had she chosen, she could have gratified his wish for the book without suffering him to know that he had deprived her of it. But this would not have suited Minnie's thirst for display. She gave up the book to Harry, but took care he should be fully aware how much she wished to keep it. Harry, of course, refused to take it from her, but Minnie insisted with an exaggerated air of kindness and sweet self-denial until the boy provoked that she should think of him so selfish as to agree to such a proposal, flung the book on the floor, and left the room in a pet. Another failure. Minnie felt disappointed, but she put her hand up to her amulet and congratulated herself upon having carefully observed its rule. It was again evening. Minnie sat by her mother's side at work, as when we saw her first, and now as then she had been very silent. She looked worried and dejected, her fingers moving slowly, listlessly, and she often drew long sighs. "You are very sad and sighing tonight, my Minnie. Has anything gone wrong with you?" her mamma asked. "Yes, mamma, everything has gone wrong," Minnie answered quickly and vehemently. "My poor little Minnie, I'm so sorry." The tender sympathy of her voice and look touched Minnie even more than the words themselves. Tired and depressed with all her failures and disappointments, she could not keep back a few tears. She turned away her head to hide them. "You see, mamma," she said after a few minutes' pause. "You know, mamma," interrupting herself, "I am as much obliged to you as ever for taking so much trouble with my amulet. But yet, I can't feel. It does not seem as if your rule did much good." "You have been trying to keep it then?" "Yes, mamma, indeed. I've tried all day. You saw how I tried this morning with George." "Yes, Minnie, I did see how you tried," Mrs. Gray said with grave emphasis. Minnie looked up quickly, but a sudden pang of conscience checked the flush of indignation. She turned away again, and again a few tears rose to her eyes. "Should you like to tell me about all your tryings, dear Minnie, and perhaps we might together find out the cause of their failure?" Mrs. Gray said very kindly. And Minnie, after a moment's thought, began slowly and excusingly to go over the history of the day. She made herself as much in the right as possible, but she could not go calmly over the various scenes without feeling conscious that she had not done quite well, and this consciousness prepared her to listen more patiently to her mother's gentle admonitions. "Dear Minnie," Mrs. Gray said, putting her arm fondly around her, "do you really think you have observed this command of God's today? It is God's rule. You must not call it mine." "Indeed, mamma, I think I have. It is what I have been trying to do all day," Minnie said, a little offended. "Have you remarked its strictness, dear Minnie? Do ye also the same likewise? Also the same likewise. That must mean that we are to do the very thing that we should do like others to do to us. The same thing in every respect, to the same extent, in the same way." Minnie looked gravely in her mother's face. A new light was beginning to dawn upon her mind. Mrs. Gray continued, drawing her little girl closer to herself, as if to soften the pain her words might give. "Had you been in George's place this morning, would it have been exactly an ungracious, grudging giving up of his seat that you should have liked from him? Had you been in Ella's place, would a scolding, cross assistance have been exactly what you would have wished for? Had you been—" But, interrupting herself as she saw Minnie's tears flow fast, "But I have said enough. I see my darling sees her mistake," and she fondly kissed the bowed-down head of the blushing, tearful child. The entrance of the boys prevented any further conversation. Minnie ran upstairs to bathe her red eyes, and when she returned the family were assembled for prayers. There was no opportunity, as she had feared there might have been, for a remark upon her quietness and gravity. When Mrs. Gray went up to Minnie's room that night, she found her in bed, but not asleep. Minnie's eyes were very wide awake, very full of thought. "Oh, mamma," she cried, turning eagerly to her mother as soon as she came in, "you are quite right. I've been all wrong. Oh, but mamma, how terribly difficult is that. Also the same likewise. It does not seem as if I could ever keep it." Mrs. Gray sat down by her daughter's bed. "Dear Minnie," she said, "have you ever looked into the inside of your amulet?" "I opened a wee bit, enough to see how prettily you had lined it with white satin," Minnie answered, a little puzzled as to the connection between her own remark and her mother's question. I did not open it far, lest I should crush it. You did not then see what is in the bag? What is in it? No, Mama. It felt so flat and smooth, I did not think of there being anything in it. She had, while speaking, drawn the amulet from her pillow and did not require her mother's smiling. Look now, to make her with her smiling look now, to make her with eager curiosity take out the velvet bag and open it. Inside was a little scroll of white satin edged with a delicate gold fringe, and on it, in the small distinct letters of the outside embroidered, were the words, "Love thy neighbor as thyself." Minnie looked up with bright intelligence to her mother as she read the words. Yes, my dear Minnie, that is the spirit of which the other rule is the manifestation. We must first love others as ourselves before we can do to them in every respect as we should like them to do to us. If you have the one commandment or command in your heart, don't you think the other would soon appear in your conduct? Yes, Mama, I see it now, Minnie answered thoughtfully, looking on the little scroll as she spoke. And yet, Mama, surely you do not think that I do not love George and Ella and them all? No, my love, I do not think so. I know that God in His goodness has given you an affectionate heart and has further given you such good, kind brothers and sisters that you can hardly help loving them. But Minnie, dear, the love may be in your heart and yet not in exercise. It may be alive but not awake. Don't you think love for them was asleep this morning when you were disobliging to George and cross to Ella? Ah, yes, Mama, I am afraid it was, Minnie answered more frankly than she had yet spoken. If I had been really loving George at that moment, I should have felt only sorry to see him so cold and glad to know I could do anything to make him comfortable. And had my love for Ella been awake and active, the sight of her poor little mournful face would have made my heart sore. And although I might have been a little sorry to leave my work, for I think, Mama, I should always have felt a little sorry about that. I was so anxious to get it done, yet still, if my love had been all right, I should have laid it aside cheerfully and given my help pleasantly. Ah, Mama, you were very right to put this rule inside the bag. The outside rule can never be kept without this inner one. There was another pause. Minnie lay silent, looking at the white scroll with its golden words as she held it in her hand. Mrs. Gray sat patiently, waiting till Minnie should speak again. She did not wish to interrupt musings which she judged from the softened expression of her child's face were beneficial. At last Minnie looked up again and spoke slowly and thoughtfully. Mama, when I found out last night how much there was I ought to do, although I was sorry that I had done so little of it hitherto, yet with the sorrow was mixed up a kind of pleasant, hopeful feeling. I saw a great deal to do, but I saw the way to do it. But now, Mama, that is something I have to feel. It does not seem that I can do anything to make myself feel the right thing at the right time. It is far easier to do to others as I would they should do to me than to love others as myself. The love is so difficult. I don't feel as if I could ever get it, ever make myself feel it. Mrs. Gray laid her head upon her child's. Minnie, dear, she said earnestly and solemnly, I have once already reminded you that these rules are God's rules, and you know, my love, who has promised to write His law on our hearts, that we may not sin against Him. His word cannot fail, dear Minnie. He cannot lie. What a sure confidence, then, have we in asking Him to keep His own promise and write His law, even this particular law, on our hearts, so that we may no longer sin against Him in this thing. Minnie looked up with a bright gleam of hope and comfort in her eyes. Mama, she whispered, will you ask God to do this for me, to give me this love? Mrs. Gray knelt by the bedside and in a few simple words prayed that the Lord, who had given His children this law, would Himself give them the strength to keep it. And she thanked Him for having taught them that they could not keep it without His teaching and help. and for having, in his great tenderness and love, given them so much encouragement to ask this thing from him. No more words passed between mother and child, except Minnie's earnest, tearful, "Thank you, dear Mama," as her mother kissed her. But Mrs. Gray left the room that night far more assured than she had been the night before that her trouble in making the amulet had not been taken in vain. Nor was she disappointed. Minnie was not naturally very amiable. Before this night she had been apt to be obliging to her elder brothers, and cross and overbearing to the little ones, and these were faults difficult to root out, and often appeared again after she had believed them quite banished. But yet from this night Minnie was convinced, as she had never before been, that it was her duty to fight against them. From this night she never wholly gave up the contest, though perhaps sometimes cold and lazy in carrying it on. She wore the amulet constantly round her neck for many years, and it constantly reminded her of the resolution she had made when she first got it, of the way in which it had shown her her complete dependence upon God's help to keep God's law. And often, when her heart was cold and careless, and higher motives had for the moment ceased to influence her, she thought of her loving mother's care and anxiety for her welfare would come vividly before her mind at the sight of the amulet, and gratitude to her would arouse her again to earnest self-denial and self-watchfulness. At first, the improvement in her was so small, the progress she made in overcoming her selfishness so slow, that her brothers and sisters seemed quite unconscious of it. And often when Minnie had striven hard to overcome her old enemies, she would be disheartened to see how little anyone except her mother seemed aware of her striving. But the ready, tender sympathy of that good mother was a never-failing comfort and help. By her teaching, Minnie was led to look to God for sympathy as well as for strength, and she came to see that it was good for her not to have too much praise from her fellow creatures, as she thus learned to desire more simply and purely to do his will. And as time passed on, and she saw how much all her brothers and sisters, both older and younger, trusted to her for help and sympathy, how confident they had learned to be that Minnie would be interested in all her concerns and ready to help them in all their difficulties, then Minnie acknowledged that she had the sweetest rewards for all her efforts, and then with a thankful heart she would clasp her little amulet and acknowledge the love and wisdom of the mother who had made it for her. And that, my friends, is the end of the amulet. Love thy neighbor as thyself, I believe was the rest of it. Yeah. The next book that I might get to read for you later is How to Be Happy, or Everyday Work for God. Aunt Annie and Her Home. Some of that fancy print's hard to read. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this book. Until next time, God bless.